Hi there, welcome back to Spring into Math 7. I'm Mrs. Campbell, and today we're going to be talking about estimating sums and differences with integers, and we're also going to be looking at how understanding the properties of addition and subtraction can help us when we're doing integer operations. Okay, so you've probably been rounding since you first started learning how to do math, and really not that much changes when we round integers. So let's take a look first of all at how we round positive integers, because it's actually pretty simple. Let's take a look. So this question asked us to estimate to the nearest thousand. It's really important when you're rounding to pay attention to where specifically the question is asking you to round. And when you're doing that, you always want to look to the digit that's to the right of that place. So in this case, if they're asking us to round to the nearest thousand, then we want to look where? In the hundreds place. So the number 52,426, if I'm rounding to the nearest thousand, I'm going to look at that 4 there in the hundreds place. Remember, 0 through 4, we round down. 5 through 9, we round up. And this really is probably just a review of all the basic rounding you've done before, so shouldn't be too difficult. So how do we round that 52,426? It just rounds to 52,000. Easy enough. How about 12,702? In this case, we've got a 7. Remember, 7 is going to round up, so our 12,702 is going to round to 13,000. Then we simply add 52,000 plus 13,000 gives us 65,000. Now, probably none of this is really new information for you, but it's a really good idea to review it, especially when we move into our next slide, rounding with negative integers. Now, the process of rounding with negative integers is exactly the same as rounding with positive integers. It's just really important to remember that when you round up in negative integers, although the digits are higher, the value is actually less. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So if I have, let's look at this number here, negative 893, okay? And I'm being asked to round it to the nearest hundred. Again, I'm going to look at the number that is to the right of that number that they're asking me to round to. In this case, I'm looking at a 9 in my tens place, and I'm going to round up to negative 900. But am I really rounding up? Let's think about that. Would you rather owe someone $893 or owe someone $900? So even though the 9 is a larger digit than 8 in this case, or 893 versus 900, negative 900 actually has a smaller value because it's farther away from 0 on a number line. So essentially, rounding is exactly the same with negative integers as it is with positive. Let's look at our next number. We have negative 769. Again, with a 6, we're going to round up. Our negative 769 gives us negative 800. So negative 900 plus negative 800, simple, negative 1,700. Okay. When we move into more and more, when we're working with expressions and doing operations and things like that, especially with integers, it's a great idea to have a firm grasp of your properties in addition and subtraction. And so I've given you some examples here of how it can help you. It's always good if you have the ability to move numbers around and shift them so that you can make the math easy for you. Let's take a look at what I'm talking about here. The first property I want to talk about is the commutative property. Looking at our sample problem here, negative 28 plus 63 plus another 28. That's the problem we're going to be working with. Now, take a look at what I've done with this problem using the commutative property. I've moved my negative 28 from the beginning of the problem to the middle, and you'll see why in a second. Eventually, it's going to make this problem so simple that I won't even have to probably get a pencil out, and you'll see what I mean by that in just a second. So just keep in mind that the commutative property tells us that numbers can be added in any order. It doesn't matter. Okay. Next property, the associative property. Remember, the associative property tells us that how we group our numbers when we're adding will not change the sum. 1 plus 2 is exactly the same thing as 2 plus 1. So that gives us some freedom in where we want to place our numbers and play around with them as we're solving the problem. So what I've done here is I had originally 63 plus negative 28 plus 28. That is where we were as of the end of the commutative property number sentence. And now I have, using the associative property, put my negative 28 right next to my positive 28. See how much simpler that's going to be? And we'll use the additive inverse property in just a second to make it even simpler. So using the additive inverse property, that property tells us that any number added to its opposite is going to give you 0. So 5 plus negative 5, 0. Negative 10 plus 10, 0. So the additive inverse is going to help us here with this negative 28 plus 28 gives us 0. Now we don't even really have to do any operations. That's kind of nice. Next thing we want to talk about is the additive identity property. And the additive identity property just basically tells us that any number plus itself, any number plus 0 is itself. So 5 plus 0, 5. 10 plus 0, 10. A million plus 0, a million. And that's basically what the additive identity property tells us. Okay, so it's really important to remember that integers are all around us. They're in the real world every day. And I like to think, I think I've mentioned this in the past, I like to think of integers in terms of money because it helps me think of owing versus having. So let's take a look at this real world problem here. Caitlin borrowed $950 to buy a computer. She has paid back $175. How much does she still owe? Now you're probably going to see a lot of questions like this in your workbooks and in problems and online. Specifically, you're going to see a lot of problems like this likely in your performance tasks. So the reason I brought this up is because it's so important to be able to write an expression for the question that they're asking you. Sometimes those words can get our heads so confused and it's hard to make sense of it. But if you can break it down into a number sentence or an expression like this, you're already off to a great start. Let's take a look at how we've written this out. Negative 950, which is how much money she borrowed, plus 175, which is how much she's already paid back, gives us x. That's what we don't know, and that's what we're going to try to solve. But now that we have an expression, all we have to do is do the operation of negative 950 plus 175 and solve. And what do we get? A negative 775, and that's how much she still owes. That just about does it for us today. Thanks for joining us here at Spring Into Math, and we'll see you next time.